In order to understand the ambitions of Imperial Japan, one must first understand their history. Let's start in 1868. The year 1868 marked a tremendous shift in the history of Japan. It was in that year that the line of imperial rulers of Japan was restored. This resulted in the dawn of the Meiji era. The Meiji era brought about many changes to Japanese society and economy. The new policies encouraged the country to open up to foreign influence and trade with foreign countries. Japan's economy industrialized and modernized at a rapid pace. Japan founded its first national army, the Imperial Japanese Army. This army was the first of its kind in Japan. Trained in Western tactics and equipped with Western weapons, the new army was a formidable force. By 1895, Japan had become powerful enough to defeat China in the First Sino-Japanese War. During the war, the modern Japanese ships and army crushed the ill-equipped Chinese army. Most of the war was fought in Korea and for Korea. When the First Sino-Japanese War ended, Japan came into great influence of Korea and Taiwan. In 1910, Japan annexed Korea and brought it into the young Empire of Japan. The First Sino-Japanese War was the first time Meiji Japan saw a military success, and will not be the last. During the First World War, Japan fought on the side of the Allies against Germany. Though Japan stayed out of the war in Europe, Japan captured German-controlled Qingdao in China and other German colonies in the Pacific. However, after the end of the war, the Japanese continued to occupy Qingdao. Most Japanese felt that since they captured the territory from the Germans, it should remain theirs. But the Chinese also contributed to the Allied cost of 140,000 Chinese laborers in exchange for the return of Qingdao and German-controlled Shandong to China after the end of the war. When it came time to conclude on the Treaty of Versailles, the former German territories were transferred to Japanese rule instead of returning to China. This brought large public outcry in China, and protests sprang up all over the country. Finally, the Chinese government took action and refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles. China then went on to sign a separate treaty with Germany in 1921 that gave Qingdao and Shandong back to China. The treaty was only symbolic, as Japan continued to occupy Shandong, but in 1922 the United States intervened and finally Shandong returned to Chinese rule. Despite the Japanese withdrawal from Shandong, their forces began to encroach on Manchuria. Since the late 19th century, Chinese Manchuria was the object of imperial expansion of both Japan and Russia. After the Russian Revolution, the Russian pursuit of Manchuria halted, only to have Japan take its place. On September 18, 1931, the Japanese army blew up a small section of the Japanese-owned South Manchuria Railroad. The Japanese government then blamed the attack on Chinese soldiers from a nearby barracks, and used the attack as a pretext for an invasion of Manchuria. The Japanese army was already prepared for the attack and proceeded to launch a full surprise advance against the Chinese. Only minutes after the explosion on the Mukden Railroad, a force of 500 Japanese soldiers completely wiped out a much larger force of roughly 7,000 Chinese soldiers in a 14-to-1 battle. By February the following year, after 5 brief months of fighting, the Japanese came into full occupation of Manchuria and set up the puppet government of Manchukuo. The official government of China insisted that everyone follow a policy of non-resistance. This made the taking of Manchuria even easier for the Japanese. Finally, the Japanese and the Chinese agreed to a truce, and control of Manchuria succeeded to Japan. For 6 more years, Japan and China did not fight, but it wouldn't be long before Japan saw another taste of success. Just as war loomed in Europe, war had already begun in China. On July 7, 1937, the Pacific War started between the Chinese and the Japanese. The first battle was fought at Marco Polo Bridge, where the Chinese faced defeat. Soon the Japanese advanced on Beijing, Shanghai, and the Chinese capital of Nanjing. By December 1937, Japan captured and occupied all the major cities in China, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. At each of the battles, Japan followed a policy of great brutality to civilians and the burning and bombing of anything in their path. This policy was especially enforced at Nanjing, where Japan purposely bombed civilian targets in order to weaken Chinese defense of the city. Once the Japanese troops entered the city, they commenced the killing of over 600,000 civilians in the city. History would remember this as the Nanjing Massacre. At the Battle for Wuhan, the Chinese forces, after resolving internal disputes and focusing on the common enemy, was capable of putting up a strong defense. By the Battle of Wuhan in June 1938, the Chinese army was able to sustain heavy damage to Japanese forces. Japan was forced to siege the city for 3 months before finally subduing the Chinese garrison. The Battle of Wuhan cost the Japanese army 140,000 soldiers. By 1939, the Japanese army was effectively halted and forced to enter a state of entrenched defense against Chinese guerrilla and resistance fighters. Just as it seemed that China fought alone against Japan, war loomed in Europe. Germany was rearming itself to invade and capture an unprepared continent. Japan, Italy, and Germany all had a common interest. Their homelands had scarce amount of resources and few allies. In May 1939, Germany and Italy signed the Pact of Steel, bringing about the first Axis Agreement. Shortly after, in September of the same year, Germany went to war against Poland over the Polish corridor dividing East Prussia and the rest of Germany. The United Kingdom and France supported Poland in the event of a German invasion, and those countries went to war with Germany. This was the start of the European theater of World War II. The United States was keen to avoid a repeat of the tragedy from World War I and refused to enter into a European war. However, the United States began to impose embargoes against Germany and Japan while shipping supplies and aid to China, Britain, and France. As Japan made further incursions into inland China and the southern Chinese coast, the United States continued to pressure Japan to withdraw. The Japanese insisted on peace, and the United States government continued to comply. However, reports of further atrocities in China did much to persuade the U.S. government to take action. The U.S. then ended all exports of oil to Japan. Faced with the loss of its lifeline, Japan began to prepare for an invasion of the rich British and Dutch oil territories of Southeast Asia. Doing so would bring Britain and the United States into a war against Japan. Seeking allies, Japan entered the Axis with Germany and Italy in September of 1940. Even with Germany as an ally, Japan still faced the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, so under the guise of peace and cooperation, Japan planned an attack on Pearl Harbor. While the top commanders of the Japanese army planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army continued its occupation of China. Life under Japanese occupation was little more than slavery. Peasants lived in fear that the Japanese army would come and take their food or their children. Even though the Japanese army greatly feared the communist guerrilla fighters, also known as the 8th Route Army. The Japanese army would burn and destroy any village or town suspected of harboring communists. Once a communist prisoner was captured, they would be lucky to be used as slaves, not tortured and killed. Prisoners of war from the US or Britain were treated only slightly better than Chinese prisoners of war. From behind the smiling face of peace, the Japanese began to move their carriers, ships, and planes into position to attack Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was of tremendous strategic value to Japan and the United States, as the United States Pacific Naval Fleet was anchored in Pearl Harbor. Attacking there would severely disable the ability of the US to attack Japanese positions in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor was brutally attacked by the Empire of Japan. Over 300 Japanese airplanes attacked Pearl Harbor and ships docked there by surprise. The Japanese sunk 8 ships including the Arizona and severely damaged another 7 ships. In total, nearly 3,000 Americans including civilians were killed and another 1,200 were badly injured. This attack devastated the United States. As a direct result, the U.S. duly declared war on Japan and Germany and joined the Allies, bringing the U.S. into World War II. However, the Japanese overlooked a much bigger picture. The U.S. entering the war on the Allied side brought a boost in soldiers, tanks, guns, ships, and planes to all fronts of the war. It also brought Britain and France to war with Japan. The factories of the U.S. no longer produced refrigerators and radios. Instead, they built every kind of weapon imaginable. Work even began on the nuclear bomb.